I'd like to welcome you to the CSU TAP's second webinar. Our topics this evening will be corn marketing and price outlook. Very fortunate tonight to have with us Dr. Steve Kuntz. Steve is a professor with the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, Colorado State University, and has just a national reputation for doing really good work in price outlook. And so I'm just very pleased to have Steve with us tonight. Steve and I do quite a bit of work together throughout the year in the area of marketing and price outlook. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Steve to go ahead and pull up his slides for the evening, and we'll go through some price outlook.
Thank you, Brent. Need a couple of seconds here. We use Teams on campus and Zoom for extension. And at the end of the day, I have to actually go do it to remember how to do it. So how's that look, Brent?
It looks like we see your slides. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. So we ready to go? Let's talk some corn market outlook. And this is actually, last week I was talking to the independent bankers of Colorado. I go there and do a grain market outlook. I'm actually a livestock market economist more per se, but at the independent bankers, they usually meet not too far from Cattle Facts, so they have Randy Block come and talk. So I have found that to fill my role at CSU, I've got to be a little more of a generalist. Can't afford to just be a livestock economist. So I've tried to keep track of what's going on in forage and grain markets, and I do a pretty comprehensive outlook there. Quite a lot of stuff, and we'll focus more on corn here. Stick pretty much to that. If you've got questions, I'd ask Brent to monitor the chat if you want to talk about something, or certainly if you need some clarification, let me know. So I'll do a little bit of weather first. That sets the stage, not so much weather in Colorado, but nationwide weather to assess how that's going to impact the nationwide or worldwide corn market. You can't really talk about what's going on with corn without recognizing what's up with soybeans. I've got some ideas about wheat as well, if you any questions on that, and then kind of wrap things up with a little bit of inputs and perspective. So a little bit on the bottom line. I like to do the bottom line first to give folks a good feel where we're going. Supplies really tightened 3 years ago, and we really needed price to ration what was available for supplies. I thought it would last 2 to 3 years, and that was about 3 years ago. I think 2022 is the peak. We're going to drift lower, but of course that depends on what we actually get for production, which depends a lot on the weather and on the various domestic and international economies. We had a pretty substantial risk premium a couple of years ago, especially triggered by what was going on in Ukraine. What was going on with Russians and Ukrainians, and that has really moderated through the year. And we still have some issues with supply chains that are going around, and it'll be interesting to see when we finally come out of the woods there. So your corn market is really your driver. Oilseeds are right behind it, relatively tight in rationing, have had strong export potential, especially on the oilseeds. Lots of weather concerns. For me, the report that came out end March was pretty surprisingly high on corn acres and low on bean acres, and I'm not sure that'll materialize. We've got some moisture problems, especially with wheat, especially in eastern Colorado for dryland crops. If we go much further, they're not going to make very much. I think you've got some very strong pricing opportunities through this year, and forward pricing needs to be done pretty aggressively. Very quickly, you've got a slowing economy. I'm kind of in the camp of a soft landing, and that's certainly not guaranteed. Internationally, we have a strong dollar that's showing a little bit of weakness, but we definitely have some pretty serious disintegration due to disintegration in the international markets due to currencies and trade issues. So I want to show you something that I found here lately that's I try to keep track of. If you Google USDA AMS and cost of production, this report will pop up. And it's not that Illinois is the most important place. It's they've been reporting these prices for Illinois for the longest. So this is the thing I keep track of. They have a nice breakdown of fertilizers, and these are FOB prices. So their prices, delivery prices out to farms in the Central Corn Belt, and also farm diesel. So what's it cost to get out there? I keep track of this. This report comes out every other month. It's a pretty nice report. AMS is adding to this, but this is the one that's been going on the longest. And what we saw with respect to last year was the really nasty run-ups in fertilizer price, in particular anhydrous, really peaking out at close to $1,600 a ton. And if you look at the most recent reports, we backed off. We're under $1,200 a ton, but backing off of the peak is not saying very much. But all of the fertilizers moved with anhydrous and your various nitrogen sources. Nothing was isolated. Everything was trying to refill that supply chain. And as well, diesel was doing it also. So really, really high cost of production last spring, and some moderation this spring, but certainly not as much as people had hoped or had talked about. So something worth keeping track of. This is certainly, I thought, was going to impact prices in the corn market, but we have pretty big promised plantings for corn. So let's take a look at futures. I'd like to take a snapshot about what's going on. So the best guess at corn in north central Illinois, the river ports, where our delivery points is roughly 560. We're talking about 550 on into next year. $5 the year after that, 475. So the market is tight now, high now, and the long run prediction for this market for an average corn price is something in the realm of 475. And again, that's a corn belt price. And if we go take a look at soybeans, what does the market think for soybeans? 13 and change for this harvest, 1250 for next year, and off at a long run price that's between 1150 and 11 and a quarter, something like that. So I like to keep track of what are those long run prices communicating. They typically are very wrong, but they're good long run predictors of where this market is headed in the meantime. Now, I know you don't buy and sell on the futures market, so something that ought to be on your desktop that you take a look at. Again, Google USDA, AMS, state grain reports or grain bids. And there's a weekly report that comes out for Colorado, and it gives you corn, gives you basis bids, various regions of the state, and the prices. So early this month, beginning of the month, we were selling corn between seven and a quarter on up to 785 in the Southeast. So worth having on your desktop to understand what's going on. And then the thing I like about it is they give you a feel for what basis is. Corn basis just incredibly strong since the weak dryland harvest last year. So my approach to outlook and forecasting is really to look at the underlying fundamentals. In this forecasting business, it's very easy to be wrong, but what I'm confident in saying is I've got a good handle on where things are now. What's going to create me being wrong by the time we get to harvest is stuff we don't see today. So we've got to understand what the underlying fundamentals look like today, and then what are our risks going forward. Of course, recognizing weather. And then I'm a bit of a technician. I like to do my charts and see what the trend lines tell me to do, and combine those two things, both technicals and fundamentals. So to start with something I have no business forecasting and I'm not interested in is guessing the weather, where we're headed. So start with the folks that are willing to do that. In particular, let's take a look at the drought monitor. Boy, and it just looks bad in southeast Colorado, central to west to southeast Kansas into the Oklahoma Panhandle. Just terribly dusty, dry, and furthermore, that dry weather is extending out into eastern Nebraska, down I-80. But this looks a whole lot better than it has for a long time. So in particular, if you go from where we are west, there's been lots of short-term moisture that has showed up in the Mountain West. So this is your short-term objective drought blend. And I just don't care for the drought monitor. I want to know where it's raining. Tell me where they have moisture, not just where it's dry. So lots of excess moisture in the Mountain West, especially some relief in California. But in particular, you see the dry weather right through the Central Plains. And this is going to be actually for the Corn Belt. This is going to be good news for things drying out from the winter and the planters getting rolling. That's going to translate into more manageable costs for the industry I do a lot of work with, which is livestock, but create a drift, potentially a drift lower in corn markets for pretty much everybody. So that's your short-term take on weather. How about the long-term moisture take? Again, you see more of the moisture in the south, east, the Mountain West, the upper Midwest, and that dry weather anchored in the southern plains and central plains. But what I'm really looking for is what does it look like through the I-states where they really set the corn market main production, and therefore that sets the base price pretty much for everybody. Something I found that's crops up on the Drought Monitor website, this potential for flash drought index. The meteorologists have figured out that if you don't have any moisture to work with, if you get hot and dry, it's going to stay dry. So this is not a good look for us going into the summer. So I think there's a good bit of concerns that's certainly not priced into the market yet. So I think there may be some volatility in the corn market over the summer because of that. And a little bit more in precipitation. I provided this for you in some of the handouts. So I really like to know, not just where is it dry, but who has moisture and how much do they have. And boy, that central Nebraska through the wintertime really had plenty of snow with which to work. The thing that has me concerned about some of the reports we'll take a look at is really it has been very cold and wet in the northern plains. And in my mind, it's pretty easy to take 1 million acres off of potential plantings for the corn crop. And I don't think the market is necessarily seeing that. So we've had some very cold weather. You take that little boot hill right into Mexico straight over to Duluth. North of that, it has been rather cold and lots of snow, whereas south of that, in particular into the southeast, quite a bit warmer. So we're going to see pretty substantial and aggressive plantings in the southeast U.S., but much slower as we move further north. And how about snowpack for Colorado? The further west you go, the better it looks. The further south you go, the better it looks. That moisture coming in from California has really been a relief for western Colorado. We're at 98% of snowpack, snow runoff potential for that which is going out the South Platte River, 74% for the Arkansas. Seasonal drought outlook, you've seen that, you've taken a look at that. What I'd like to jump ahead to is to look at the precipitation outlook. This first one is for April, and the second one on the right-hand side is for the window April, May, June, and greens are wetter than normal. So we're not seeing the relief that we'd like to see in the Central Plains, and we're seeing the traditional El Nino patterns that might show up in the desert Southwest. But likewise, lots of forecasts for substantial moisture in the eastern corn belt. So I don't think we see a lot of pressure on the corn crop with respect to dry weather. That eastern corn belt is going to look good. And then the precipitation outlook, this is across the summer. This top row of maps is a 3-month rolling precipitation outlook into September. And again, I'm looking for dry weather in the corn belt that might indicate we're going to make a run at very high corn prices again, and you simply don't see that. Okay, so we made a run back in 2021 at almost $8. We did it again in 2022. Will we do it again in 2023? Depends on that weather, depends on what goes on there, but we also need to worry about planted acres. The prospective planting says 92 million acres for this coming year. Our expectations prior to that report was about 91. USDA's forecast was 91. and we were looking at 88.6 as of last year. So I still think we've got to get through the planting season for the Northern Plains to see what's really planted in that area. My outlook is, we're potentially headed to $5 if all those acres get in. But if we don't get the Northern Plains acres and we have some dry weather, we'll certainly be up to 6.25 and potentially 6.40 through the trading time period. So let's take a look specifically at Colorado. We're looking at almost 4% more corn, and we're looking at 4% more nationwide. Let's dig in a little bit and see what states. As you would expect, the I states are up 2 to 5%. And there are these big increases in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota that I don't think will necessarily materialize. I do think North Dakota has a whole lot more chance to look like it did last year than this prospective plantings for this year. So again, I think it's very easy to take almost 1 million acres out of North Dakota if they're not able to get planting and relatively soon. Half that corn crop is planted, a little less than half is planted by April, and the rest of it is planted in June. So we're way early yet. We really have to see how this plays out into June, and keeping track of your crop progress reports through the season. So crop progress is coming out, tells us about the percent of the corn crop that's planted. If you look at Colorado, we've planted 1%, and typically we've planted 2% by this time. Well, how about nationwide? Last year, by this time, we had planted 4% of the crop. Last year, 4%. This year, we're at 8%. We're still way early in the season. And typically, over a 5-year period, we've planted 5% of the crop. So the rubber hits the road really over the next 5 weeks. You have to keep track of this particular report. It's good to watch to know what's going on. Here's your prospective plantings at 92 million acres. I think that's a bit aggressive. If you think about it, if you look at our corn prices over the last several years, it looks like we've had a substantial drought with respect to corn yields. And that's simply not the case when you actually look at the actual yields. This market has been very hungry for corn. It's looked for a big crop for somewhere in the last 3 years and simply has not materialized. So that's where the concern has come from. But think about it, folks, we've had $8 corn and had nothing like the drought we did in 2012. That tells me about the upside of this market. Tightened up stocks 3 years ago, and this market is kind of in a panic. It's got relatively tight stocks, and it's had that for the last 3 years. So almost anything, I believe, can potentially set it off, and it can move it substantially higher. If you take a look at corn use, the one that takes it in the teeth when prices run up are exports, and that is what you see. You saw that in 2012. You've seen it this year. There's very high prices create very limited export opportunities. And that's simply not the case when you take a look at the feed side. The feed side depends on how many pigs and how many hogs you have, or how many pigs and how many chickens you have. So talked about those exports. Let's take a look at net corn sales to date. And the current year is in red, last year is in blue, 5-year average is in green. Those very high prices limit your export potential. And I like to focus on China. China tends to be a market mover. What are they up to? Rather comparable to last year and early. So what they're doing, what that tells me is they've gotten bad news about the Brazilian crop. So not only are we kind of dry going into the year, the Brazilians were rather dry through their growing season in our winter, their summer. Worldwide, not much to write home about, a little bit of tightening of stocks, but really not much going on there. Usually I have folks ask me questions about that, so that's why I have this stuff. It's not something that's a main driver unless it's a main driver. And what's going on with respect to exports is really business as usual. If you go back, you see the real strong drought in Brazil back in 20 and 21. We picked up a lot of those exports in terms of the U.S. picking them up, and not much other folks really participate heavily in this market. All right, so let's take a look at the balance sheet. I'm happy to forecast prices, and what I promise you, I'll write the number really small so you can't see what it is if you don't have your reading glasses on. Anyway, so this is looking at the WASD report, the most recent, and I take the most recent WASD report and wiggle the numbers a little bit. And at this stage of the game, the thing that moves is potentially exports. So how big might those export get? How weak might they get? And what does that mean for the rest of the year? And I think we sit where we are, where we're used to seeing the cash market in Colorado. We sit in that 7 range until we get closer and closer and closer to harvest. All right. Now, when I forecast, I take the Goldilocks approach. I've got the one that's too hard. I've got the one that's too soft, and then I've got the one that's just right. I don't believe we'll get 92 million acres nationwide. I think we're in the works for something like 90. Right now, trend yields are about 178, and when you work the math on that, you get a stocks to use of about 13%. That's mid to low fives at harvest, and $6 potentially through the year, and $6 in the Colorado market. Now, if we do get those 92 million acres, then we're talking about the high fours at harvest and low fives through the year. And if we come up short again in acres, very comparable to last year because of weather conditions, again, I think it's plenty dry that the crop will get planted. It's a matter of what does harvest and what does yields look like. So if you shave a little bit off yields, then we're looking at staying where we are at 9% stocks to use. And if I think we stay where we are on top of 3 years of being here, we're going to have some panicked users of grain, and they will run these prices relatively high. So what camp am I in? I think we'll have some concerns early in the year. We'll make some runs into the sixes, 6.25, 640, something like that. And then what tends to happen is we get good news through the year. The panic shows up, people pretty aggressively buy, but in the real world, what happens is there's enough moisture somewhere to make a decent crop. Now, I don't think that moisture somewhere to make a decent crop is going to be Southwest Kansas. That doesn't look like it's in the works so far. So that's my take on the outlook for Colorado, and I'd like to go take a look at the Ag Manager to see what's up with basis. Brent is going to tell you got to keep track of basis. This is a great place to start. We've got pretty strong basis in the Texas Panhandle. And then let's compare basis this year, right now, to over the last 3 years. And what we see is we have very strong basis. And again, that dry land crop simply did not materialize. Therefore, what did we have to do? We had to bring it in from Nebraska and South Dakota and places like that. You got to pay much higher prices to attract that and pay that freight. So looking at the 2022 crop, I don't think we're looking at a price chart doing something like this. What I think we're looking at is what DEES 2023 is doing. It's drifting lower. We've got a nice trend line in place. And then we've got a price floor that's currently sitting about 550. So I'm watching this trend line and I'm watching this support plane. And if it breaks the support plane, that tells me that the crop is getting planted and we have adequate moisture. And if we break the trend line and move higher, that's what it has to do to move higher. That means somebody's concerned, somebody's running up the price to secure supplies. So let's do your charts. Brent, I'm going to move on and do a little bit on soybeans. Pull the hook on me as soon as I'm running you out of time. Let's dig into those acres a little bit. Let's jump all the way to the plantings. There's some big plantings again in those northern states, 15% more in North Dakota, and I'm not sure that will materialize. And really soft plantings in the I states. So I think we could come up potentially short, very short of bean acres, or contrarily, we could see if plantings are slow because of, for example, the northern part of the Corn Belt is going to see some flurries tomorrow, I believe. That will delay corn plantings, and what you do is you transition into soybeans. So I think these might actually go up some, and these will certainly head down some. And let's take a look at the corn soybean price ratio. The line between the two is kind of an even split. And then if you lean this way, you're leaning towards corn and you want to plant more corn acres. And this is about where we're sitting. And I think it's a bit of a wash when you look at the fertilizer prices. It's not a clear winner for corn when you look at those higher anhydrous prices in particular. So let's jump ahead. Exports, something worth watching on the bean side of things, because we had a long, slow growth in exports over time. And then when the Chinese really entered this market substantially, the exports have grown a lot. So let's look at net exports and exports to China. Again, those high prices will take some of the steam out of export sales. This year's red, last year's green, and blue is blue is last year, green is the 5-year average. And now let's focus on China. And we see that they're kind of a little soft compared to last year and really tracking the 5-year average. I expect them to show up, and that will reveal to us problems with the South American crop. Is there something really of issue there? So what about that South American crop? Well, your soybean growing region is really right through here. And you've got some places that are extremely dry, and you've got some places with very adequate moisture. So I think we will hear about both stories. And this is looking at February. And then let's look a little further back through time to see about the whole growing season. And it's rather the same thing. Very dry further south and plenty of moisture up north. So where are we at with respect to soybeans? Same exercise. We're really tight right now, 4.8% stocks to use. And I think with the variations in the different planted acres on the bean side of things, we could be between 4.5 and 12. If we're at 12, we're talking $12 beans. And if we tighten up a little bit from where we are again, we'll push up into the 15s. So again, I think really the action is on the planting side of things. So let's take a look. What does the chart look like for soybeans? We've seen the soybeans maintain strength, whereas corn is weakened. And that's because of that export potential, really strong export potential on soybeans. Some weakness here lately. When soybeans move, they move a buck and a half in a hurry. And let's take a look at where those beans go. The meal market, in particular, I want to point out to you how strong the meal market is. Soybean meal is just rocking, over $400 a ton, very expensive. And then soybean oil, part of this is biodiesel, part of this is the restarting economy. Back in 2021, really running it higher. And then when we went into 22, we ran it up to 90 cents. And, 90 cents is just a ridiculously high soybean oil price. So the oil potential in the food oil potentials in the markets out there are very, very strong. Not something I'm sure you're too worried about, but that's going to drive some soybean acres in the upper Midwest. All right, so let's ease on over and look at those input markets again. This is one of my favorite charts. Usually only pigs are free. But here, if you go back to the pandemic, we see oil traded for minus $40 a barrel. Well, it doesn't trade down there for very long. But here's your economy restarting, but we're talking $70, $80 oil moving forward. And the thing that I want to point out to you is how far natural gas has fallen. If we go back and take a look at the concern about the gas market in Europe, well, the European gas market has had a very mild winter, as has the East Coast of the United States. So we're well off from those very high gas prices down into the $2 range for natural gas. I just don't understand why fertilizer producers aren't trying to run, if you can buy $2 natural gas and make fertilizer, you'd want to make a lot of fertilizer, run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So I expect to see that fertilizer market really take a break, but it's going to be after planting is well done. I expect to see fertilizer to move off rather substantially. Fertilizer really made a run in 2021, trying to refill that supply chain, has moderated some through 2022 and is headed lower or not increasing as fast in 2023. So this is a producer price index. It's between not producers as in users of fertilizer, but folks that are actually producing the fertilizer. How much are they getting? They're not getting nearly as much as they used to. You know what diesel's up to. Ag chemicals used to be the story, and now they're getting in on the act as well and rallying pretty strong. The bottom line is I'm a bit surprised at how big the prospective plantings acres for corn was looking at this input mix. It's come off a little bit, but it certainly hasn't come off enough to justify folks wanting to plant 92 million acres. And then all the talk about inflation, we're finally seeing some moderation on inflation on the producer price index. So I expect the inflation news somewhere down the road to be rather good. Interest rates, I have a bone to pick with the Fed about wanting inflation to be 2%. I think that's way too low. 2% is what you could do when you were in between the Great Recession and the pandemic. And I think we really ought to be thinking about 3 and 4% inflation with the economy, how it is. So I think there's a pretty good chance the Fed will keep their foot on the brakes pretty hard. We'll have to see if they change their mind. And then the dollar index, this is the strength of your dollar. If you want to buy beef or corn or wheat or soybeans, the first thing you have to do is you have to buy dollars to buy those products. And here was the run up in the dollar during the Great Recession. Here's Brexit. Here's the pandemic. And here's how well the US economy is doing compared to the rest of the world. Now, it looks to me like the rest of the world is saying, hey, we want our money back with respect to some of that inflation, but we still have an extremely high priced dollar. And we are very much at full employment, very, very much at full employment. So the economy does not look like it's slowing down a whole heck of a lot as yet, but it's working on it. It is working on it. So I thought the acres were very high in the report. We need to take a look, keep an eye on plantings through the next 5 weeks in particular. I think there will be some concerns about cold and wet up north, and we will rally the corn market because of that. And I think producers need to look hard at what they have for a crop in the field and say, what's my break even? Should I get some price? Because I do think we're headed to 5 1/4, certainly if not this year, then next year. And oil seeds, they continue to have a strong export growth, and the food use side of the oil tends to be very, very strong. So those prices are going to be very good and fight for some corn acres in that process. So watch your charts, and I would recommend getting pretty aggressively getting forward priced. I think corn is going to be weaker, but not weak. Soybeans are really the secondary driver at this stage of the game. And of course, it all depends on the weather that we have for this coming year. So Brent, that's a lightning round of corn outlook.
Thanks, Steve. We have some time for some questions of Steve. So anything that caught your eye or questions you have, a pretty small group tonight. So feel free to unmute your mic and just ask away.
And Brent, just to get this up for the recording, folks that look at this later, if there's something you want to ask or run by me, or do I know exactly where things are going? No. Do I think I have an idea of what's likely to come up next? Yes. And that's the story you tell. And if you want to talk about it at some stage down the road, you want to run some pricing ideas by me, then drop me an email. I'd be happy to talk with you about that.
Okay. Steve, let me ask a quick question as a corn grower. Last year and especially the year before, the very best thing I could have done as a corn grower is nothing. Wait to harvest and sell it all. Do you think this year is stacking up to be a year like that, or a more normal year in terms of marketing?
I think I think this is the year to not do that. I would be pretty aggressive early on. Like I said, I do think there'll be some weather concerns and some acre concerns early. Now, I'm sure not the only one saying that, which leads me to believe it's already in the market. But I do think there'll be some concerns early on. But if we get anywhere close to 90 or 91 million acres planted, and we have good moisture, really good moisture starting in the eastern corn belt and working its way west, then those prices will soften. So I think this is the year that we learn not to do what we did last year. Good question, Brett. I think you really need to look hard at what is a good long run strategy and go back to implementing some of those things. Don't look so much in the rearview mirror. I don't see this year as a replay of last year.
Okay.
Last year was a replay of the year before. This year is not a replay of last year.
Along those same lines, if we look at charts again, prior to last year and the year before, we can see that, typically we have some of the higher markets in that June, early July period of time. Do you think that would be something to consider for this year? Or I'm kind of hearing you say if we do have a run up in prices, it may be quite a bit earlier than
Yeah,
normal.
my concern, Brent, is it's going to be earlier than that. See,
Okay.
I'm watching this downtrend here. I think 550 will hold until we have a real good reason to go below 550, and that means plenty of acres and with good moisture. So I think we'll break this trend line, and then we'll run it back. We'll run back to $6 potentially in a hurry. 615, and then the top is 640. So I think if you can get priced in the low sixes, I'd be pretty comfortable doing that. And
Great.
if that really makes you nervous, wait for the market to run up and then buy some out of the money puts. Get down here in the high fives. I would wait for the market to run up and buy some high to mid five puts. Do something like that. Whatever you're comfortable with.
One of the things, Steve, that's unique about the TAPS program is we have limited the marketing tools that participants can use. And so they have the ability to use a forward contract. They can use a basis contract. They can go with a hedge to arrive, a simple hedge to arrive, no rollovers, and then futures. And the futures positions, once they put those on, they've got to maintain those until the cash crop is sold. So given our restrictions in terms of marketing methods that this group might utilize, any particular thoughts there about one particular method maybe over another one?
I think I like your basis contract idea. I think people that have sold corn or bought corn have paid sticker shock basis prices. So can you offer me anything for new crop basis contracts? I should have looked that up, but I don't have that on the top of my head, Brent. Any idea what those are, what folks are quoting?
I don't, Steve. I'm seeing for contracts at 15 over, but I've not seen, and I'm assuming basis contracts are going to be comparable to that. Yeah.
So I think 15 over is probably not as strong as they might get in any sort of run up. If we get some run ups, I think I'd do forward contracts or basis contracts when they show you they're a little more hungry for grain. And some of those guys have paid $1 over in basis or 70 cents over in basis. So I think I'd wait for something closer to 50. And once you got that, I think I'd grab some of those. The thing about using a basis contract in futures is then you set both your risks. You've set your price level risk and your basis risk. And your forward contract makes you do that at both of those at the same time. Now, that forward contract, one of the things that's why it's only 15 over is that if they make margin calls, then it's out of their pocket, and that comes out of what they're pricing for you. So I think I'd wait for them to get a little hungrier, and then I'd really do what you're comfortable with. If you really don't like futures, then without a doubt, you run into people who have a bad experience right out of the box. Do something you're comfortable with, but I think folks are going to get a little nervous once we get further into the spring.
And it's interesting you say that. One of the other advantages to the TAPS program is it really allows people to do some things outside of their comfort zone, both from a marketing standpoint, but also a production standpoint. So if you're curious about how futures work and want to try some, this is a great opportunity, because obviously you're not going to be on the hook for margin calls. Yeah. So I know we have some producers that are going to do some pretty innovative and maybe what people might consider drastic ideas regarding maybe deficit irrigation or greatly reducing fertilizer inputs, just to see how that affects the bottom line. Play the marketing game the same way. If you're would probably never consider a futures contract on your own corn or in your own farm, try one of the TAPS program. Just get a feel for how it works.
Yeah, I would strongly encourage that you do something, if you're not on the hook for it, if there's not enough a lot of personal risk or individual business risk, try something new, try something you haven't done before because it's really concerned you. So I'm with you on that, Brent. I would think outside the box a little bit. I'd be a little bit aggressive, try a couple of three things you wouldn't normally do, and then analyze them when you get done. Because I'm afraid that 2023 might be a year again where things just drift lower, and anybody who is aggressive early is going to look really smart. And I'm not sure, that usually doesn't play out in lots of years. I think you've got to be a little more balanced. But I think being a little more aggressive this year might look good at the end of the year.
Other questions for Steve? Again, great time to ask those questions. And as we've talked about, thinking out of the box is part of what the TAPS program is all about. So if you want to do some out of the box thinking regarding marketing, this is your opportunity. Steve, are you going to be able to stay with us for the next 45 minutes, half hour or so?
Absolutely. You might
Okay.
hear me, you might hear the ice cubes jingle in my glass, though. So
Okay, sounds good. So we'll ask Steve to stay with us. That way, if questions come up, we will have some time toward the end of the program this evening. So I'm going to go ahead. Steve has stopped his screen sharing. I'm going to then share my screen and talk just a little bit about marketing. And I did allude to this a little earlier. I do a lot of work with Steve in the area of marketing. In fact, we kind of collaborate and have for a number of years in a grain marketing program. Last year, we did a program specifically for corn producers. The program consisted of 12 hours of instruction. We met for a couple hours during the noon hour and plus for 6 weeks. And then Steve was able to join us, I think it was 4 times throughout the rest of the year at the time of very market moving reports or news and talk about how that report would change outlook. So I'm certainly not going to try to duplicate what it takes 6 weeks to do. So I'm going to take a little different approach rather than obviously a how-to marketing course, which I just couldn't do justice to given the time we have tonight. I want to take a little different approach to it. And Steve has heard this before, and so that's why he alluded to we'll talk a little bit about basis. So what I like to do, rather than try to encourage or even work toward the idea of let's spend all our effort trying to top the market. First of all, I think that's very difficult to do. I think it's impossible to do, actually. I can tell you, and I know that Steve feels the same way, if he or I, either one, had the ability to top the market, we certainly wouldn't be with you tonight. We would be on our private island somewhere very warm, a very warm place of the planet, and probably sipping an adult beverage. But since neither and I have that ability, we're here with you tonight, which we enjoy the opportunity. So approach that I really like, and I can't claim this for my own. This is actually something that I have borrowed from Ed Ussett, who is with the University of Minnesota. And Ed really talks about, again, rather than trying to top that market all the time, let's see if maybe we can't get into the upper third of the market, or if maybe we've consistently marketed in the lower third, can we get to the middle third? And the way that Ed really looks at this is he kind of compares it to a professional tennis player. And he said, a professional tennis player, the really good ones, probably do not concentrate on serving an ace every time, or even being able to return every serve 100% of the time. They really look at analyzing their game, determining what are the mistakes they make, and then trying to minimize those mistakes. And that's really what Ed has recommended with these 5 common mistakes in grain marketing. The idea being, let's identify these 5 mistakes that most producers make, and then let's take measures to reduce the mistakes. Again, not with the goal of topping the market, but hopefully moving us from the third we're currently in to the upper third. So let me introduce these 5 to you, and we'll talk briefly about those with the time we have tonight. The first one is not knowing your cost of production. Number 2 is reluctance to pre-harvest price crops. 3 is failure to understand and track local bases. 4 is to have a failure to have a pricing strategy. And I'll mention the 5th one. However, we're not going to talk about it tonight. That one being holding unpriced grain in storage too long. Obviously, with the restrictions we have in TAPS, you're not marketing old crop corn, and you won't be marketing old crop as we harvest the 2023 crop. So it's just mentioned as part of the 5 that Ed has outlined, but obviously we won't talk about it tonight. So certainly we'll start off with not knowing your cost of production. Probably all of you here know what cost of production is. Basically, it's fixed or overhead cost plus our variable cost. As you can see from this slide, a few examples of each one of these. I do mention this in that what I find is most producers are very, very good at being able to determine their variable cost. If I were to ask them the cost per bushel to produce corn, typically they can give me those variable costs within just a few cents. But when I say, are those your total costs? And those include the overhead costs, fixed costs, land, taxes, insurance, then we develop some issues, and primarily from a standpoint that they don't know what those are, but it's sometimes very difficult to come up with a method to equitably allocate those fixed costs to your various enterprises. And if you recall, when we met a week ago when we talked about the EPIC program, that's one of the basic designs of that program, is to provide a method whereby producers can allocate those fixed costs to an enterprise in order to come up with total cost of production. So certainly total cost of production is important to enterprise selection, but it's essential for developing a marketing plan. If you really don't know your cost of production, you have no idea if a market is offering you a price that's a profitable level and at what level of profitability that might be. One of the things I've noticed in corn budgets, for example, in many cases, the fixed costs can be as much as $1 per bushel of the total cost of production. So if a producer does not do a good job of allocating those fixed costs, they're really kidding themselves with the cost of production that only includes variable costs, and actually could be thinking their cost of production is $1 a bushel lower than it actually is. And so it's very easy for them to make poor marketing decisions based on a cost of production that's not accurate. So as you'll recall, we've provided a tool for you to use to help you do a good job of putting together very accurate enterprise budgets that include total costs, not only on a per unit, or in our case, a bushel amount, but also per acre. And as we mentioned last week, talking about crop insurance, certainly that per acre cost of production can help you select what level of crop insurance you want. But if we look at that per bushel basis, then that's very helpful in determining if the market is truly offering you a price that exceeds that cost of production and would produce a profit for the operation. A second problem is reluctance to pre-harvest price crops and really waiting for either harvest time to price your crops, or to rely very, very heavily on storage in order as a method then to market old crop commodities. One of the reasons that we really need to look at pre-harvest pricing, corn especially, is just the nature of the corn market. And as Steve and I alluded to earlier, last year and the year before were really anomalies in that we saw the highest prices of the year right around harvest. Typically that doesn't happen. And some research that Ed did, University of Minnesota, he looked at the December corn futures from 1990 through 2014. And he took a snapshot or looked at that price at May 1st, about the time we're planting corn, to October 1st. And he found that in 19 out of that 25-year period, or 76% of the time, corn prices dipped lower in 3 or 4 of the years by an average of 29 cents per bushel. So the price was higher in May than it was in October, 19 out of 25 years, or 76% of the time. And 3 out of those 4 years, it was 29 cents a bushel. So hopefully that makes the case that pre-harvest pricing crops, corn especially, is something that 75, 76% of the time is going to work. Because of that, it's something that we really need to look at. And again, I think one of the very valuable parts to the TAP experience is you're given 4 different methods that you can use to effectively pre-harvest price the corn that you produce in the TAPS program. Again, we're looking at the opportunity through TAPS to do a forward contract, a basis contract with delivery at harvest, a simple hedge to arrive, and by simple we mean no rollovers allowed, and then a futures contract. And each one of these is pretty well described in your TAPS handbook, as well as some restrictions that we have, again, just for the purposes of the contest. Very quickly, though, to talk about each one of these methods, if we look at forward contracts, basically this is a contract for the cash sale of grain or livestock at a specific price for future delivery. Pretty easy to understand. Certainly some advantages. We've set the price. Price meaning we've the price of the commodity plus the basis. No additional marketing costs are required of the producer. Those are assumed by the buyer. And again, it's very simple. Some disadvantages, typically there's little flexibility in the delivery point. Normally it's specified in the contract. And again, no opportunity to take advantage of improving prices. So once we've signed that contract, again, we've set price. It also may require delivery of the contracted commodity. And that's why we always want to consider utilizing crop insurance to backstop for contracts. A basis contract with delivery at harvest. This contract establishes the basis used to determine the cash price paid for grain at a later time. It does eliminate the basis risk, but not futures risk, because we've not locked that in. And again, it's used when a producer feels the basis level will widen in the future. And so Steve mentioned basis contracts may be something to consider as we move forward in this marketing year. Simple hedge to arrive, sometimes called a non-roll hedge to arrive. This time we're setting that futures price, but we're going to wait and set basis at a later date. Again, it protects against the futures price risk. Basis risk remains until you've actually set that. You've really got to understand and track your local basis to make basis contracts work. And we'll talk about the importance of tracking basis and understanding it a little later. Again, basis risk is normally smaller than futures risk, and it's somewhat more predictable. And so this may be a contract that might be a little bit more comfortable for some people because, again, of the maybe greater level of predictability as composed or compared to a futures contract. And then finally, a futures contract. I've got these slides a little out of order here. Let's talk basically, it's that binding agreement between a buyer and seller to deliver or take delivery of underlying commodity at a specified future date with agreed upon payment terms. If we get into futures in a lot of detail, you'll find most of the contracts are not actually delivered. They're offset. If you take a look at the detailed instructions in your TAPS handbook, it talks about we will have you offset any futures positions that you put on. And again, the nice thing about futures contracts is they're standardized. Because they're standardized, we can trade futures contracts across the globe, and we do that. Backing up one slide, many of you are probably familiar with this. Corn contract specifications are listed here. The thing that's important for you to realize is, again, per your TAPS handbook, we've set the minimum number of bushels per contract to a standardized futures contract, a full contract at 5,000 bushels. Third mistake that we tend to make in grain marketing is failure to understand and track local basis. Very briefly, we understand that basis is the difference between a cash price and a futures price. Sometimes we'll call that cash price a local price. Basis is determined by demand, freight costs, and other factors. Some terminology, when the cash price is lower than futures, we typically say futures is under. When cash is higher, we say basis is over. And certainly we're in a situation in the corn in Colorado, and a lot of our cash markets where basis is over. When the spread between cash and futures decreases, we say the basis is narrowing. And when the spread between cash and futures increases, we say basis is widening. And occasionally we'll see cash and futures are equal. And in that case, we would designate that as being zero basis, or basis is zero. First of all, a couple of tools that you might use to predict local basis. Actually, Steve alluded to one in his slides. Again, the source being the same as this one, K-State. If you simply Google K-State interactive basis tool, you'll come across this tool. There are several Colorado markets that are used or tracked by K-State. In fact, if you look at this screen, if you'll click the here button, click here, you'll find a full list of the locations in Colorado. Gives you the opportunity to indicate a city, a state, or a zip code. This particular tool will provide basis for grain, sorghum, corn, wheat, and soybeans. And then you can do either an average of the last 3 years, 5 years, or a specific year. The chart or the tool will actually produce both a chart and a table. You can see here I'm looking at a market for corn in Pete's, Colorado. I'm looking for a 3-year average, and I can pull together a chart that looks at basis for that particular market. This is actually a 3-year basis, and the basis is determined by the week of the year. If you prefer a chart, you can actually look at a chart. Obviously, the numbers that are in parentheses, basis is under. So you can get the information in either one. I'm also going to show another tool for determining basis. This happens to be a commercial site. It does a site that'll cost you, I believe it's $25 a month in order to subscribe to, because it's not a free site, a land grant university sanctioned site. I do have a product disclaimer here, basically saying that it's not necessarily an endorsement or discrimination or criticism for any site that I don't mention. That site is GeoGrain. This is a site that actually was put together by a couple of graduate students. I think they were graduates of our students at Montana State University. One was an ag marketing, ag econ student. The other was computer science student. They got together, developed the site, and basically what it does is any grain merchandiser company across the country that supports a website where they post their prices on a daily basis, this site will pull that information, makes it available to people who subscribe to the site. Just as we saw with the previous site, it does some really good basis information, both current basis, spot prices, and also basis prediction. The cool thing about this particular program is you can actually put in the address or GPS coordinates of your own farm or ranch. This is one that we use on our own operation. If you're familiar with Logan County, that's North Sterling Reservoir. Our farm was about 7 miles south there. And so this happened to be a basis map that I pulled for spot prices within 100 miles distance radius of our farm for corn. Has a really nice function in that it uses a traffic light method of depicting basis. The best basis is listed in the green. Then we go to an orange and then into a yellow, or excuse me, a yellow, then an orange, and then red. So it gives you a visual of what spot prices are and what's happening in basis within a geographic region from your particular farm. Can also produce some basis charts. This happens to be from Roggen Farmers Elevator in Pierce, looking at current basis for that location as compared to a regional range within about 200 miles historic average of the last 5 years. So again, some tools you can use to track your local basis. Again, this particular company also provides cash bids, and it'll actually send this information in an email on a daily basis, the days that the market is actually in operation. Fourth, failure to have a pricing strategy. We talked about the need for pre-harvest market planning, kind of a strategic approach. Important to know your cost of production. Again, using either revenue protection, which we have available to us in the TAPS program, to determine how many bushels that we can pre-harvest price. Here's just a quick example again from Ed Ussett of what a pre-harvest marketing plan would look like. Again, what our expected production is, the level of crop insurance we might buy, how many bushels we would have to market, and then a series of triggers. We predetermine at what price would we sell a certain number of bushels and by a certain date. And so that's the typical components of a marketing plan, actually developing those triggers, having a plan and executing that plan. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to share with you tonight, one of the other parts of a good marketing strategy is understanding the tools you have available, which tools are the best to use. What's that best tool in the toolbox for you to utilize? And in order to do that, I really like to look at this matrix. And this matrix looks at two different components. It looks at futures prices and basis. And you notice that it's kind of a matrix, a 4-quadrant matrix. And so if we look at the upper left-hand quadrant, if we have a situation where we anticipate prices are rising, futures prices, and basis is strengthening, if we're talking about old crop, we probably would store that in weight. We might look at a delayed pricing contract or a minimum price contract. If we look at the lower left, in this case, we think basis is going to strengthen, but we're thinking futures prices might decline. So hedge would work, a non-roll hedge to arrive. So a couple of the tools that you have in your TAPS toolbox might be appropriate, or possibly buying a put option. If we look at the upper right-hand quadrant, in this case, we expect futures prices to rise, but our basis may be weakening. Basis contracts might look good there. We might sell cash bushels and buy futures or call options, or again, a minimum price contract. And then finally, if we're in a situation where both futures prices are expected to go down, we think basis is weakened, we might make cash sales now if we're talking about crop and storage, or this would be the time that possibly a forward contract, again, one of the tools we have available to us in TAPS, might work. So I'm going to stop there. I did rush through that a little bit. Again, understanding what we really wanted to do was just give you some things to ponder in terms of putting together a market strategy. Certainly didn't want to advertise this as a marketing class by any means. But at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and again, ask if we have any questions, either questions of myself or questions of Steve.
Yeah. Thank you, Brent. This is Tim Martin. A question that I think you know from the handbook, but just to emphasize, what are the marketing options, or when do our participants have to, when can they get into marketing, and when do they have to be done?
So, and Tim, back me up here a little bit. I believe they can actually start marketing the 21st, which is tomorrow.
Okay.
And they can do their forward pricing up till harvest time. Once harvest time is started or the crop is harvested, obviously that ends the opportunity to use the forward contracts. At that point, then they do have, I believe, until the end of the 30th of November to do any cash marketing they would like to do. And we're, the idea would be as you cash market, then you would offset any futures positions and offset any other forward pricing positions that you have put in place prior to harvest. And then the idea being that any positions that have not been offset by November 30th will be automatically offset through the contest rules. And there is a bit of a per bushel penalty for not offsetting those positions. So certainly want to track what you're doing as you place some kind of a forward pricing tool and make sure that you follow through with offsetting those and making sure that you've cash marketed the crop after harvest.
Thanks, Brent.
Brent, I really like your 4-quadrant tool. It's a couple of really nice ways to break things down, and I like the targets, and I'm pretty sure that's a Ed Usick approach as well. Setting those price targets and having a good idea of where you want to go, what prices need to be to market, and be careful about being willing to change those. Sometimes you can get to June and July and things have changed rather a lot. So you may want to modify your targets a little bit, but setting them early on and then sticking with them until you know something really dramatically different. Really good strategy.
So, Brent, another question, just in terms of process. We appreciate yours and Stephen's inputs here. They're really valuable and a great resource for us here at with CSU and with the TAPS program. If certain producers or certain competitors, have a reasonable need, a need and a reasonable time requirement to contact you, like, okay, I've read the book, I know this, and I have experience with it, but I want to answer or address a specific question about marketing or about insurance. Is that something you're open to accommodating, especially Brent, with your schedule and day job, so to speak?
Yes, I'm certainly more than happy to do that. I put a qualifier on the marketing questions, and this is one that I know Steve uses, and I think there's a lot of merit to it. I know Steve has often made the offer to assist folks in marketing questions, but he puts a little bit of a onus on the producer, and that typically is, if you know your cost of production, I'll be happy to help you. And I like that because that does force the producer to do their homework. And actually, if they don't do that, it's difficult for Steve or myself or anyone else to give really sound advice. So I might challenge our TAPS participants to say, I know I would be, and I'm not going to speak for Steve, I'll let him do that. But I think from the marketing standpoint, I'd be more than happy to answer questions and be as helpful as I could. If you come with the cost of production. And we've made it quite easy for you in TAPS because, everything's laid out. You just have to basically make some production decisions, put it together. But so it's much easier to do under the control we've placed for you with TAPS, and it might be in a real life situation. But from my standpoint, yeah, I'm here to help out, and typically email is the best way to get a hold of me. But I would ask, from the marketing standpoint, get Epic out, dust it off, put together a good budget, have a cost of production, and then we can talk.
Yeah, and I would echo that. The other thing, the other loaded question I like to ask is not only what's your cost of production, but how much money do you really want to make? And if your answer is absolutely as much as possible, then you need to go to Vegas and go that way. But talking about what are goals and things like that, trying to, like Brent said when you started, trying to pick the top of the market is just an impossibility. The only people that can do it are lucky, and they're usually not lucky all the time. So, it's hard for someone to teach marketing or crop insurance or budgeting from somebody starting from scratch. But if you've done some of your homework and want to run some ideas by somebody, I'm happy to listen to that. And email is a great way to start, but it doesn't have to be email. It's very easy to team or Zoom and do some communication that way. It's a matter. Most of the things that I talk to producers about, they already really know what they want to do. They just want to run some ideas by somebody, and that's the best way. But if you need some help starting with something, I'm happy to do that. And Brent, I really like your, number one, the Ag Manager Basis tool is a really good tool to put in your toolbox. And I realize you got to be careful advocating for stuff that costs money, but the GeoGrain and that basis tool, in the end, $25 is pretty cheap compared to the mistakes it can help you avoid and the opportunities it can help you create for yourself. So that's a really positive tool.
Well, we've gone over just a little bit, but I do want to give everyone one more opportunity. If you have any questions, please be sure and ask at this point.
Can I ask a question that we can probably cut off the recording? Maybe I can ask it afterwards, because it's just sort of a speculative question, just trying to understand how the push and pull dynamics of crop insurance and extended drought and supplies, and how people are maybe looking at making their decisions accordingly. I'm just curious, when people think about their bottom lines, with the last few years being people leaning pretty heavily in some places on crop insurance, like in Southwest Canada, just you're not supposed to be using that to make a bottom line, but at the same time, the situation sometimes can feed into that. And it's just sort of, when people set their goals, how are they setting their goals in this extended drought environment? I guess that's my question, like what is that push pull like in terms of setting goals and achieving them? Sorry, that's not a very good question, but do you see what I'm getting at? It's sort of like, I sort of see there's these various factors that Steve was describing with all these world pressures and the corn versus soybeans and all of that. And then there's the local conditions and just the dryness, this extended dryness, and how that's affecting things now. I mean, you've seen these cycles. I guess I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that, because it's something we wonder a lot about, just focused on the high plains, I guess. Either any feedback on that question?
Yeah, let me maybe approach the crop insurance side of it, and then Steve, if you wouldn't mind, maybe the more of the marketing. One of the issues that we have with crop insurance and an extended drought is, as we talked about last week, the level of coverage is determined by your APH, your actual production history. And one of the things that an extended drought has done is it's decreased yields for a number of years, to the point that there's been a major effect on the APH. So even the amount of insurance a producer can purchase has been reduced, and that's caused some real issues. I work with some dryland producers in southeastern Colorado that have just had a terrible time with their wheat yields. And it gets to the point that it's almost impossible for them to cover a major percentage of their input costs through crop insurance. So their operations become more risky year after year after year because of that. And unfortunately, because that APH is typically a 10-year average, it takes a while to build it back up. And so those are some real issues that they're struggling with. And so one of the things that I've seen is, unfortunately, as the APH decreases, they have to purchase a higher level of insurance to make up the difference in revenue. And so that insurance component of their budget becomes more and more expensive. So that's been a real challenge for them to manage. And it's going to take a time for us to dig out of that. We're going to have a number of very, very good yielding years to build that APH up to get to the point that they can purchase a lower percentage policy and save a little money. Now, having said that, one thing that's been a bit of a saving grace is we've had very good reference prices or beginning prices because markets have been good. So it's offset that to some extent. If we get to a point that Steve has talked about where we see corn and wheat prices get back to pre-pandemic, Ukrainian war levels, and they have those low APHs, then that's going to be that'll be a big issue. It'll be really a cause for concern in their ability to manage risk.
Yeah, and I think, you just have to recognize the realism of that situation. It's hard to say that, but if you get a good deal with crop insurance and then the conditions persist, that good deal evaporates. And it's hard to plan on those tools being able to offset that problem. Likewise, you really can't use marketing to solve a cost of production problem. You can't use marketing to solve a drought problem. You have to be careful what you're trying to do with what and how much risk you take. And I get no comfort in saying this, but there are certain conditions out there in the world that the deck is really stacked against you, and it requires you to make some very prudent choices going forward to protect those family assets. So just being really cautious or going back to kind of old school risk management becomes more important in that situation. But I do know many not many, but I'm familiar with producers that tried to use marketing to get their way out of production issues, production problems, and that's pretty risky. To go that way is, I'm not looking forward to the next couple of years. We've got conditions where here in the high plains, it's extremely dry. It's not very good. And there are other places with plenty of moisture and plenty of opportunity. And we just have to be very cautious. I wish I had a little more positive news on there, but one of the more important things is being reasonable and realistic.
I appreciate those answers. Thanks a lot. I almost feel like that's another thing I'm wondering if people can come to you with. It's sort of like, well, I'm tempted to do this.
Yeah.
Or based on the stack up of factors, maybe what's the better path?
There's and I try to be real careful in giving marketing advice. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what's going to happen next. I can just tell you what I think, what I know, and based on experience. And if you're in a position where you've got a lot of risk ahead of you and not much opportunity, you need to be very careful with those choices you make.
Well, very good. Steve, thank you for your time tonight. I always enjoy listening to you as a corn producer myself. I always get some insight that I feel is very helpful for our own operation. So I really appreciate that. And thank those of you that are on tonight. Hopefully this was informative, and we'll make the recording available soon. And again, if you attended tonight, but something you want to review, that recording works well for that. And Also, if one of your teammates couldn't make it, encourage them to look up the recording. With
Yeah.
that, we'll go ahead and call it good for this evening, and wish you luck as you move forward with the TAPS program.
Good to see you all.
Thank you, Brent.